World News Today, brought to you by Continental Radio and Television Corporation, makers of Admiral Radio, America's smart set. By shortwave broadcast, direct from important overseas stations, as well as leading news centers of our own country, CBS correspondents are waiting to bring you a complete report from the world's political and battlefronts. But first, here's Doug Edwards.
The Germans have launched a sea and airborne attack today against the Dodecanese island of Kos, which was recently occupied by the British. Allied Fifth Army troops on the Italian mainland have captured Benevento, northeast of Naples, while the British Eighth Army, striking swiftly up the Adriatic side, has lopped off a wide area. The Royal Air Force bombed Munich again last night, and Berlin reports the German troops in South Russia have evacuated the town of Taman on the peninsula directly across the Kerch Strait from the Crimea. For our first news direct from overseas, Admiral Radio takes you now to CBS Algiers. Winston Burdett reporting.
All along the Italian front, from Naples across the Apennine Mountains to the Adriatic coast, the Germans are fighting bitter rearguard actions against the Allied advance. The fall of Naples really marked a stage in the battle. Both sides are now regrouping for another major clash. Once again, the vital sector is on our left flank on the coast. But instead of mountains this time, we have a clear plain stretching 25 miles northward, where both we and the Germans can throw in heavy armored forces. French and Patriot troops have all but ousted the Germans from Corsica. French headquarters this afternoon announced that Moroccan sharpshooters have driven the Germans off Tigina Hill, just 4 miles outside of Bastia. Further north, a small party of American Rangers has struck through to the coast. The result is that the Germans now hold a dangerously narrow 30-mile strip north and south of Bastia. They are pulling out in a hurry, both from the port and from the beaches. Behind the military news of the past week, there has been one development that is worth remarking on: the political reorganization that has been taking place in Corsica. The Corsican resistance movement, which opened the fight against the Germans, have recognized the authority of the French Committee of National Liberation in Algiers. The new prefect or governor named by the committee has approved virtually all the popular elections held throughout Corsica when the organized patriot drive against the Germans began. The Corsicans have now set up a new committee, a purification committee it is called, to deal with Corsican officials and others who have collaborated with the enemy. This committee began its work today. All charges must be laid before it by the 1st of next month. It will complete its report by November 10th, and the accused will then stand trial for war crimes. These developments in Corsica are significant because they foreshadow what may one day happen in France itself. The French Commissioner of the Interior, André Philippe, who is responsible for coordinating French resistance movements, told correspondents here yesterday that he expected to see the same sort of process in France when France is liberated. The same preparedness, the same quick popular reaction, and the same general pattern of cooperation between the French National Committee and the people in France who have been organizing to resist the enemy. How strong those people are, we don't know. But they are a force, a political force for the future. A hint of their numbers was given in an official French statement today. It said that since mid-July, 54,000 young Frenchmen have escaped deportation to Germany and have joined the 150,000 who already are hiding out in the French Alps and the Pyrenees. They are going to have a rough winter, but someday they will come back. I return you now to New York.
More news in just a moment, but first here's Warren Sweeney with a word from Admiral Radio.
A flying fortress formation recently returning from a bombing mission over France was attacked by a swarm of Volke-Wolfs. One fort, an engine knocked out, lurched out of control, leveled off, and began to fall behind. Immediately, 8 enemy planes roared in for the kill. High above, a Thunderbolt pilot saw the action. Over the radio, an Admiral-built radio perhaps, flashed the command, "Follow me, I'm going to help that fort below." 4 American fighter planes peeled off into screaming dives, ripped into the Nazis, scattered and drove them away from their intended victim. The fort was badly hurt. To halt its rapid loss of altitude, every movable object was ruthlessly thrown overboard, even guns and ammunition. During the long journey back, the 4 fighter planes covered their crippled mate like a protective umbrella. Then, as they finally approached the coast of England, radio again came into action, this time with a message to an emergency field clearing a runway for a crash landing, a landing that brought a priceless crew of American boys into safety. Here is another dramatic example of the part radio is playing in this war. Radio equipment now being turned out at top speed at the great Admiral plants. Though in wartime production now, Admiral is already planning for conversion to peacetime duties to the building of the new Admiral, America's Smart Set. Now, here once again is Doug Edwards.
Allied planes in Britain have carried out new night and day attacks against Germany and the enemy-occupied continent. For this news and to report on other developments, Admiral Radio takes you to CBS London. Larry Lasser reporting.
The young men of the United States 8th Army Air Force went over the top again today. In B-26 Marauder bombers, the Americans roared in low-level formations across the choppy North Sea. Escorted by Poles, Czechs, Belgians, Australians, and Englishmen in Spitfires, all the Americans returned safely after bombing 3 enemy airfields in Holland. 7 German fighters that attempted to interfere were shot down by the Spitfires. The young Americans who fly the big fortresses over Europe are immensely cheered to know that we've opened a second front in the air from the Mediterranean side. Heretofore, every fortress that flew over Germany was coming from only one place, and the Germans knew it. So they were able to concentrate their fighters facing England. Now that southern Germany has been bombed in daylight by American fortresses from Africa, the Germans will have to redistribute their fighter strength. I've just spent a day with the fortress flyers. They didn't go on operations that day. They just sat around, read the papers, and listened to the radio. In the afternoon, they received their pay, and the big poker game started. The fortress boys play poker the way they fly, swashbuckling and deadly. They peeled off pound notes, 5 and 10 at a time, to draw a single card, and they showed little emotion whether they won or lost. I saw very little sign of any mental strain among these young men who take their lives in their hands almost every week. Doctors on the airfield informed me that if an airman is going to crack under the strain, he's likely to show it during his first 5 raids. But the doctors believe that any anxiety neurosis among the fortress men is not caused by fighting enemy fighters in flak over Germany, but that latent neuroses are brought out by the tremendous strain. And even such cases are comparatively rare. However, I learned that almost no man can go through the strain of completing 25 fortress raids over Germany without showing some signs of mental wear and tear. I noticed that the boys do comparatively little drinking, except on party night, and then they let themselves go. Their favorite beverage on party night is a form of punch. For those who may be interested, it's compounded of grapefruit juice, pineapple juice, and plenty of Jamaica rum. For understandable reasons, it's called a flying fortress. We return you now to New York and Doug Edwards.
The eastern Mediterranean is back in the news again today. German forces are trying to win back an Italian island in the Dodecanese taken by the British a short time ago. For the latest news on this development, Admiral Radio takes you now to CBS Cairo. James Fleming reporting.
Early this Sunday morning, the Germans launched an attack on the Allied-held island of Kos, the Dodecanese. This effort by the enemy to regain control of this strategic Aegean island is described as a sea and airborne assault. The island of Kos is the 3rd largest in the Dodecanese group. It lies close to the coastline of Turkey and is well behind the enemy's outer positions on Rhodes, Crete, and Starpanto. In mid-September, we took over Kos, along with the islands of Leros and Samos. The Italians had been occupying these positions, and on the arrival of Allied forces after the armistice, they cooperated with us as co-belligerents. The fact that the Germans chose to go after Kos underlines the importance of air power in the defense of the Aegean. For Kos boasts one of the finest airfields to be found in any of the islands. The Nazis have made several heavy raids against this aerodrome during the past few days. How strong the attacking German forces are, we do not yet know. The only announcement from Allied quarters thus far is the first reassuring phrase that necessary countermeasures have been taken. Lieutenant Harold Hare, an American fighter pilot formerly based in North Africa, is based in Cairo these days, recovering from 12 days of floating in the Mediterranean after bailing out during an encounter with some Messerschmitt fighters. Lieutenant Hare, who comes from North Dakota, floated around in one of those inflated rescue dinghies, often within sight of Allied ships, but day after day unable to signal his presence to them. Then for the last 5 days, he was within sight of the North African shore, but the strong currents and his own weakened condition made it impossible for him to row into land. He lived on the meat of a turtle, not very good, he says, some small birds, and 1 canteen of water. In the last stages of exhaustion, he was finally picked up by an Australian corvette. He's okay now, getting plenty of rest, making a good recovery here in Cairo. His is just one of thousands of stories of American courage and endurance. It's a good idea now and then to remind ourselves that the real sacrifices are made not back of the lines at home, but at the front. This is James Fleming in Cairo. I now return you to New York and Doug Edwards.
The French National Committee is reported about to enter discussions on the status of French prisoners in Spain. For a direct report from Spain and a summary of the news filtering into that country, Admiral Radio takes you to CBS Madrid. Glenn Stadler reporting.
Report from...
We regret the interruption of our broadcast from Madrid. But now for a summary of the battlefield situation in Italy, here is Columbia's military analyst, Major George Fielding Elliott.
The capture of Benevento by the Fifth Army, in effect, turns the line of the Volturno River, on which speculation had centered as a possible next stand by the retreating Germans. Meanwhile, the Eighth Army continues its swift advance up the east coast of the Italian peninsula. Its reported position is due north of Benevento. There is a distinct possibility that its advanced elements are much farther up the coast, perhaps as far as a point opposite Rome. Thus, dramatically and swiftly is developing the situation which has been foreseen. Thus are the Germans being presented with a growing bill of account for having taken the terrific risk of fighting in southern Italy at all. There is now some prospect, to put it conservatively, that the German troops which fought at Salerno and before Naples may be cut off altogether and surrounded with their backs against the sea somewhere between Naples and Rome. This prospect is increased by the heavy bombing of communications in their rear and by the progress being made in the reduction of the last German foothold on Corsica. On that island, French-Moroccan troops have taken a hill which the communique terms the key to Bastia. From Corsican bases, the roads of the Italian peninsula can be bombed at ranges under 100 miles. It would seem certain that the Germans must now choose between a race for the shelter of the northern mountains and the putting in the peninsula of Italy of yet more troops to stem the Eighth Army's advance before that army can cut westward and chop off the line of retreat of von Kesselring's forces from Naples. Any German attempt to stand south of Rome or at Rome takes on more and more of a suicidal character as the situation unfolds.
That was Major George Fielding Elliott. In this country, the food and manpower problems are still getting major attention. For a report on the latest developments and an interview with one of our naval heroes, Admiral Radio takes you to CBS Washington. Robert Lewis reporting.
The heads of 3 economic agencies, in a statement summarizing government efforts to control the threat of inflation, report that the battle is being won, but that the real fight is still ahead. The War Food Administration, in its continuing efforts to increase the food supplies of the nation, tomorrow will start unveiling its 1944 crop production goals. Representatives of the agency will begin conferences with state leaders throughout the country, explaining to them the scope of the program. The goals, as set up, would give the nation a slightly larger supply of food than it produced this year. And tomorrow, the Supreme Court of the United States begins its 153rd year. In Congress, Secretary of the Treasury Morgenthau is scheduled to present his new tax program. He's expected to call for an additional $10 billion in federal excises. Tomorrow also, the Senate will resume debate of the father draft question. Latest developments in that field come from Draft Director Hershey, who suggested that more efficient use could be made of men now classified as 4F. The Navy Department reports in a communique this afternoon that a lone American reconnaissance plane flying over the Japanese-held island of Nauru in the Central Pacific beat off 9 attacking Zeros, shooting down 1 of them. And every American knows the legend of the battleship X and her famous commander, Rear Admiral Thomas Lee Gatch, who did so much to turn the tide of battle in the South Pacific just a year ago this month. Newly commissioned, fresh from her trial runs, this 35,000-ton battle wagon sailed into the Battle of Santa Cruz on October 26th and into the same murderous kind of Japanese torpedo plane attack which killed the Prince of Wales in repulse. But the X, maneuvering at better than 27 knots, shot down 32 enemy dive bombers with a hail of steel so awesome that the commander of American aircraft signaled his men away. He yelled, "Stay away from that big bastard. She's shooting down the sky." Admiral, then Captain Gatch, was badly wounded during that encounter. But 3 weeks later, he took the X into Windy Gulch off Salvo Island. where in a weird and deadly night engagement, 5 Japanese warships were sunk. Previously, this ship was known simply as the X, to hide her secrets of armament and greatly increased firepower. But now the Navy has revealed her as the USS South Dakota. Today, her skipper, during those historic engagements, is here to tell you of the ship he proudly calls the greatest in the world, Rear Admiral Thomas Lee Gatch.
That's exactly my opinion. The South Dakota is the greatest in the world, including the much-vaunted Admiral Tirpitz. And I'd like to say something about her. She was built by the New York Shipbuilding Corporation in Camden, New Jersey. She was commissioned in March 1942, but didn't get to sea until June because it takes a long time to finish a battleship's turrets. But from the minute we hit salt water, those of us who knew a ship knew that this one was perfect. She ran as quietly and efficiently as a sewing machine. Every one of the crew loved her. This enthusiasm continued throughout the grueling weeks of trial runs and fire practices. You know, in peacetime, it takes a year for a new crew to learn to handle a ship in battle, but we did it a lot faster. My navigator said I kept saying, "That's the rottenest shooting I've ever seen," and sometimes I'd just grunt. But 2 days before we got into battle, I conceded that the shooting was pretty good.
Well, that sounds like a masterly understatement, Admiral. And that kind of shooting changed the opinion of some so-called experts about the value of the battleship, didn't it?
I hope it gave them something to think about. I think the first action, when the Japs tried to relieve Guadalcanal by superior air power in the daytime, proved that the battleship, with proper air coordination, rules the seas. And the Savo Island fight, with the Air Force out of it, demonstrated that there is no match for the battleship except equally good battleships. I rather think the battleship is here to stay.
But what about the Japanese battleships, Admiral?
The Japanese build good ships, but every time we've met them on anything like equal terms, they've been overwhelmingly defeated. I think we will keep on doing it.
Well, I'm sure that America shares that confidence, Admiral Gatch, thanks to you, your officers and men of the USS South Dakota, formerly the Battleship X. And this is Robert Lewis in Washington. Now back to CBS New York and Doug Edwards.
Allied troops have chalked up another victory against the Japs in the Southwest Pacific. For this news and other developments in the Pacific, Admiral Radio takes you to CBS Honolulu, Webley Edwards reporting.
The most important immediate objectives of the United States forces in the Pacific are the Marshall and Carolines Islands. The most direct route to Tokyo is not through New Britain and the islands infested by the Japs in the Southwest Pacific. If our forces must approach the Japanese inner domain via the island-hopping route, slowly and laboriously conquering island by island, the war would last for more years than we like to think about. We must hit more directly at the Jap through the Marshalls and Carolines, and this we will do when the Pacific timetable calls for it. We must provoke a major sea battle with the Jap and destroy or cripple his fleet. This is the gist of conversations I have had with men here at Pearl Harbor who've been fighting the Jap for nearly 22 months now. To these men, the fall of Finchhaven in New Guinea, which has just been announced, is good news. For its fall continues to put pressure on the Japs' outer perimeter of defense in that area, plus its pressure is being put on the Japs from the Aleutian and from recent air attacks on Marcus and Gilbert Island. All of these tend to keep the Jap defenses spread as thin as possible. Finchhaven's fall puts the Allies in control of all the area leading to Rabaul on New Britain from the west and the south. The slow push of the Americans up from the Solomons is opening the way to Rabaul from the south and east. There is, however, some evidence that Rabaul is no longer the mighty Jap base it once was. That the Japs have pulled some of their strength back from Rabaul to their inner domain. The drive toward the Marshall and Caroline Islands has been a necessity of the Pacific campaign from the outset. To most of us who follow this Pacific War, it has been something that was far, far over the horizon, in some happy day to come. That happy day is much closer than we had dared hope for. There are strong indications that the might of the Pacific Fleet is aimed at the heart of the Jap defenses rather than to the outer fringes of the defense perimeter. The nearer that time approaches, the less talk you can get from Navy leaders here. Right now, they are saying nothing, which experience shows is a good sign out here. When you're ready for heavy action, you don't have to do much talking about it. There are many warships and planes now on hand in the Pacific to do the talking. This is Webley Edwards at Pearl Harbor. I return you now to New York.
An item from the Far East. American planes based in China have carried out one of their biggest attacks to date. Our liberators have blasted the Jap base at Haiphong in Indochina. We set fire to the power plant, warehouses, and dock installations with more than 50 tons of explosives. Jap interceptors came after our big bombers, but they didn't do so well. We shot down 30 Zeros, probably destroyed another 14, and damaged 5. In spite of the fierce battle, only 6 of our liberators were damaged. Escorting P-40s and P-38s were undamaged. On the Russian front, Radio Berlin this morning broadcast a communique announcing a new withdrawal. Taman, on the peninsula directly across the Kiev Strait from the Crimea, is now said to have been evacuated. No word from Moscow yet, but the latest Russian communique told of the capture of 2 important towns east of Taman. The German evacuation of Taman means that the defeated Nazi armies of the Caucasus, the troops that once held great areas and stubbornly defended their Kuban bridgehead against Soviet offensives, are finally being driven out of the Crimea. Nazi propaganda minister Goebbels today let the German people on what's in store for those who attempt to undermine the belief in victory. Goebbels said the Reich is prepared to cut off the heads of those persons. He bitterly criticized Germans on the home front who, he said, by their loss of faith, are stabbing soldiers in the back. And now, once again, here is Warren Sweeney with a message from our sponsor.
Salt is a deadly enemy of metal. Those of you who live near the ocean have seen the license plates on your car rust. The plated steel decorations turn to a discolored red because of the destructive action of salt water. In building seagoing radio equipment, the corrosive action of salt is a problem of major importance. Admiral-built instruments now going to our armed forces are pre-tested to meet this challenge. In an airtight cabinet, known to Admiral engineers as a salt chamber, parts going into such radios are sprayed under pressure by a highly saturated salt solution. This treatment continues not for minutes or even hours, but literally for days. Though completely encrusted with salt when finally removed, these delicate parts must still meet Admiral's exacting standards of performance. Here is one of many thorough tests Admiral equipment must pass before being accepted for seagoing duty. Tests that assure rugged dependability wherever Admiral equipment may serve on our many fighting fronts.
Attention, men and women of Chicago. Your country needs you. Help build vital communication equipment for our frontline fighters at the great Admiral plants in Chicago. The work is easy and interesting. No experience is necessary, and you'll be paid while learning. The factories are modern with the latest type machinery as well as company cafeterias for your convenience. Simply go to the employment office of the Admiral plant at 4150 North Knox Avenue by taking a Montrose streetcar to 4600 West. Or take the Armitage Avenue car to the Admiral plant at 3815 Armitage. Get into radio now, the modern business with a great future. World News Today is brought to you each Sunday at this hour by Continental Radio and Television Corporation, makers of Admiral Radio, America's smart set. Be sure to listen again next Sunday when Admiral brings you World News Today by shortwave, direct from the leading news centers of the world. This is the Columbia Broadcasting System.
The WBBM Theater, Wrigley Building, Chicago.